Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Mr. Kroth. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. Can you please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Okay, I'm a professor from Santa Clara University, retired psychologist, wrote a number of books and two or three on JFK. Most recently, I did a video called The Most Important Discovery on the JFK Assassination in 50 Years, just like this summer. And like 500 people watched it, then 1,000, and then 5,000, and then 10,000, and then 50,000. And it got up to 164,000 people watched that video. So it's about a little tiny element of the whole theory that's in my book on JFK. And the theory, it's hard to give you the whole picture, but Oswald did not kill JFK, never shot anybody in his life, never killed anybody in his life. He was duped, he was set up. And the theory in the book, by the way, that video was about a letter that Oswald wrote
to Mr. Hunt.
Yeah, you heard that. No,
I watched your video. Yeah.
Yeah, it's cool. So, I mean, that kind of shows that he was being set up by a guy, Mr. Hunt, whoever that was. Anyway, the book is based on a confession that Howard Hunt made. He was a CIA agent. He's always denied he was in Dallas. He's dying. His son comes to his bedside and said, "Dad, I know you wrote the books. Tell me the truth. What really happened?" And so his father tells him that Lyndon Johnson was involved in the Kennedy assassination. So that forms the basis of my book. And there are 2 or 3 or 4 other books that implicate LBJ. LBJ, so should I start at the top there with LBJ?
Yeah, go ahead. I mean, I've talked to well over 60 experts on the lone nut and conspiracy side of things. So a lot of like the video you mentioned, in that video, he talks about, oh, we had ideas of slather and LSD on a driver's steering wheel. And I'm just like, whether it's if they attempted it or not, that's still nuts that he's saying something like that. And that's a member who was in the CIA.
The reason Lyndon Johnson comes up is that if you've read the background on the Kennedy brothers and books like that are more about Kennedy and his personality and what he's doing, less about the assassination, you realize that Kennedy and Johnson hated each other, and Johnson was a bully, a gigantic man, and he bullied people, and he really thought he made the biggest mistake of his life by becoming vice president, because he lost all of his power, all of his pork, all of his influence. And then Bobby Kennedy said, we got to get Lyndon Johnson off the ticket in 1964. And Bobby Kennedy sort of helped create these controversies with Billy Saul Estes and Johnson's aide. And Johnson was being investigated for ethics violations. And he was scared to death. He left Washington, D.C., went to Dallas, stay out of the public eye. And then he planned the Dallas campaign of Kennedy coming to Texas. Kennedy didn't want to go to Texas. Johnson insisted. It's important for the Democratic Party. So Kennedy reluctantly says, okay, we'll go and we'll do it. But Johnson set up the whole parade route, all of the visitations, and he was the only major person not to testify at the Warren Commission under oath. He hired all of the people who ran the Warren Commission, but he would have otherwise lost his. If Kennedy had survived the assassination, Johnson would have not been on the ticket for 1964 and probably would have gone to jail for ethics violations. Billy Saul Estes went to jail. Bobby Baker I think, went to jail. His personal assistant, Johnson, was headed that way. He knew his career was over. And he said the only way to put an end to this is to put an end to JFK. Now, there were other people who also wanted to put an end to JFK, the Mafia first and foremost, and also the CIA that really didn't like what he did in Cuba. So Johnson puts together a consortium of people, the CIA, Angleton. I don't know if you want me to name these names, but the head of the CIA wet ops operations, along with Angleton, along with perhaps Helms,
Alan
certainly
Dulles.
with Alan Dulles, certainly with the complicity of J. Edgar Hoover, and then Johnny Rosselli is a very important person. He's a mafiosi who's very close to this CIA guy. And they set up the Chicago mob to go to Dallas and hit Kennedy. And they drive down, and the man who was supposed to hit Kennedy was named Chucky Nicoletti. And he was in the Daltex building. He missed, hit him in the throat, second shot, third shot, fourth shot. Fourth shot comes from a guy named, it was 21-year-old guy named James Files, who was a nobody. He was just a wannabe mafiosi. He knew about guns and explosives, and they said, you stand here at the grassy knoll. We're going to hit him from behind, because they want to set Oswald up from shooting as the shooter from behind. Don't hit him in the front unless we miss. So Files is standing there and says, I see the guy, he's grabbing his throat, but we were going for a headshot, and I'm sorry, I didn't see him get hit. So I fired 30 meters, easy shot, one shot, hit him in the right temple, blew his head off. So James Files is the only person in the Kennedy drama who's still alive. He's 77, he lives in Illinois, and he murdered President John F. Kennedy, in my view. Now, there are a lot of things about James Files that make very little sense. I mean, he's said things here and said things there that do not kind of fit. So if you get into James Files, who was a criminal, remember, criminals don't always tell the truth about everything. But in my research, I cannot refute James Files. He knows too much. And I think that the most sensible theory about the killing of John F. Kennedy was a grand conspiracy initiated by LBJ with the complicity of the CIA, where the mob does the hit. James Files puts his little gun into a briefcase. There are lots of people around dressed as Secret Service agents, and they shoo off the police. He walks away, and with Johnny Rosselli and Chucky Nicoletti, they get in a car, they drive to Mesquite, Texas, stay overnight, drive back to Chicago the next day. He gets $36,000 cash, never speaks about the assassination, keeps his mouth shut, gets arrested in the 1990s for trying to shoot a cop, or attempted murder, something like that. And then he notices that everybody's dead. Giancana's dead. Hoover's dead. LBJ is dead. All the Rosselli is dead. Chucky Nicoletti, his boss, is dead. And then he starts talking in the 1990s. And people say, oh, that's impossible. That's impossible. But when I interviewed him over the course of 15, 20 years, while he was in prison, we wrote back and forth. I said, how does this guy know these things? He just knows too much. And there's a very good book that you, since you've interviewed 65 people, are you familiar with Giancana's book, Double Cross?
I really haven't nobody's really mentioned this character at all.
Oh, he's important. He's really important. Double Cross is written by Giancana's brother. And it's about how Giancana and the Chicago mob killed Kennedy. So it was farmed out to the Chicago mob, but the CIA was intimately involved. Howard Hunt was involved. We don't quite know what. David Atlee Phillips from the CIA was setting up people, setting up the parade route, working with the CIA. I forgot the guy's name now. I'm very sorry. I should have. The guy from the CIA Black Ops. Anyway, probably 15 people involved in this process. It's in all kind of mapped out in the back of my book. You never heard about this, the mob connection to the assassination?
I've looked into, and I think the most plausible one that I've heard recently was a friend of mine, Barry Jones, who wrote a book called Coup d'etat, and he talked about during the Watergate hearings when there's that 18 minutes of missing tape that was allegedly in there, and that was when they were talking about the JFK assassination. Like, I've talked to Jim DiEugeno, I've talked to Gary Aguilar, I've talked to so many other people that are involved into the assassination, but nobody ever really focused specifically on it. I mean, besides David Denton, who talked about like individual mob figures like Roselli, and that were obviously working for the CIA. But I always thought it was like a grand conspiracy from the military-industrial complex. I mean,
I know, but I've heard that. I can see that there's like Lansdale and those people, but the key people are Jim Mars wrote a book on,
Crossfire.
yeah, and that's all about the mafia. Remember, Bobby Kennedy was a moralist. He wanted to be a priest, and he said, "I'm going to take care of the mob, and I'm going to get Jimmy Hoffa and put him in prison." And he prosecuted 750 mafiosi, even though J. Edgar Hoover would not cooperate at all. J. Edgar Hoover was trans, and the mafia had pictures of him having sex with his longtime partner, Clyde Tolson, and he never did anything to upset the mob. So Bobby Kennedy prosecuted the mob without the help of the FBI, and he was very successful. And the mob said, "We got to stop Robert Kennedy." And
Lyndon
we can't.
Johnson was trans?
No. J. Edgar Hoover
Oh,
was.
okay. I know that. I know that. I thought you said Lyndon
Okay,
Johnson. I was like, hang on a second.
no. I'm going too fast. Obviously, we can't put Lyndon Johnson in a dress. No.
J. Edgar
Okay.
Hoover is more picturable.
Exactly. So anyway, the mob really said, we have to stop Bobby Kennedy. He's destroying our organization. But if we kill him, his brother is the president of the United States. His brother will prosecute all of us. We have to kill the president. And then Bobby is just another lawyer. So that's how they hatched that's why they wanted to kill Kennedy. And when the CIA and the military and LBJ got involved, they said, let's do this.
Do you put a lot of weight? I mean, I know about the Cuba incidents, I know about the Vietnam incidents, I also know about the less talked about one, Indonesia, that was going on with Alan Dulles owning a gold mine down there, or was at least in his name, which I had Greg Polgrain on the show talk about that as well too. But when it comes to the relationship between Bobby Kennedy and his brother, they had such a close relationship, a bond. Obviously, they're brothers, but that pisses off the whole entire anybody in the administration, J. Edgar Hoover, Lyndon Johnson, any of these characters, because it's a secret conversations they don't have to share. It's two brothers chatting and talking about policies. I mean, they're making a bunch of stuff happen that none of the other military generals or anybody else is involved in.
That's true. However, in my book, there's a book called A Question of Character, which not too many people have read. I don't think JFK told Bobby everything. JFK had a sexual addiction, and he did not tell Bobby that he was having sex with Giancana's girlfriend, Judith Exner Campbell. Okay. And Bobby would not have prosecuted the mafia as extensively as he did if he knew how many women the mob supplied to JFK's father and to JFK. So Judith Exner Campbell was sleeping with Giancana, and then she was sleeping with JFK in 1961. Okay. You know that story, right?
I've never heard any of this.
Okay. In my first book on JFK, he slept with 33 women in 33 months in office. And most of these women were, a lot of them were one-time stands, and there were many that are unnamed. But a number of these relationships went on for 6 months. Judith I'm sorry, Mary Meyer slept with him for 6 months. She was the last one to have sex with him. Marilyn Monroe, Jane Mansfield,
I've heard Marilyn
Angie,
Monroe.
Angie Dickinson. There's a whole list. And so I don't think JFK told his brother everything. His brother knew. His brother found out that JFK had slept with a prostitute from East Germany, Ellen Romish. And he said, "Oh my God, a KGB prostitute is sleeping with the president of the United States? Get her out of this country." He deported her. Okay, so there's a whole set of drama stories there about that. But I don't think that Bobby knew everything that JFK was doing with the mob and how he had been compromised. Giancana, in that book, if you read it, he felt that he helped Kennedy become president. He got Chicago and Illinois to vote for Kennedy for president. And then suddenly Bobby is prosecuting him. That's double cross.
Yeah, you got me. This is the first I'm hearing of this, man. Like I said, any of the JFK researchers, most of them never talk about any of the scandals, never mention even Marilyn Monroe, which I think a lot of people know to be true. So this is the first I've ever heard of any of this.
Well, Anthony Summers wrote a book on Marilyn Monroe, and it looks like she was about ready to say that Bobby and she was about ready to have a press conference and say that she had sex with the president. And Bobby flew around. If you read carefully about her death, it looks like she was killed by a mafiosi who gave her a suppository and drugged her and killed her in her apartment, in her house. And then it was covered up and made it look like suicide. But her psychiatrist said she wasn't suicidal. She was about ready to spill the beans to the press about the Kennedys.
So who had more control over the mafia?
A guy named Tony Accardo, who was above Sam Giancana in Chicago. And then there's Trafficante in Florida and Marcello in Louisiana. All three of them are conspiring together about the big event. That's what they call the assassination. But Giancana provides the hitmen.
So Giancana provides the hitman. I'm curious because they talked about the big event twice. They talked about something in Dallas, but I don't know if it was mentioned as the big event. But I think they're talking about getting Jim Lavelle involved into the Dallas police down there.
There was somebody, and I don't know his name, but there was someone who joined the Dallas Police Department a few weeks before the assassination. He's implicated in something. I have to go and look at my notes to find him, but there is such a person.
Hmm. Now, when it comes to Lyndon Johnson, when Kennedy died, what happened after? Like, because I always said that I didn't think Lyndon Johnson planned the assassination. I said he was probably part of the cover up because the one thing was like, why would you sit your vehicle right behind Kennedy with that James Tague bullet? You don't know how accurate that guy's going to be. What happens if a bullet hits your car?
There's a whole picture of Lyndon Johnson bending down and hiding underneath the front. I mean, there's one photograph of Johnson bending down, and they said, "Why are you bending down?" He said, "I'm trying to listen to the chatter on the radio more." But he was bending down at the time of the bullets flying on Elm Street. Okay, he knew what was going to happen. He set up the turn. The car had to slow down to 11 miles an hour to make that turn. Normally, when they go through a large crowd, the car is traveling at 45 miles an hour. It's hard to hit the moving target. But now it slows to 11 miles an hour and makes a left-hand turn, and all of the shots are being fired at this time. He knew that was going to happen. He said he had something to say about the parade route.
It was suspicious that he tried to get Connolly to ride in his vehicle, like he wanted Connolly to sit in his car, not JFK's.
That's because he didn't want Connolly to get shot. They were friends. He wanted a senator to sit there because the senator he didn't like him, and he wanted to get Connolly out of the danger. But that's when he was arguing with Kennedy, and he insisted to get Connolly to ride in his car, and JFK said, "No, he's the governor. I want to sit. He should be in our car, not a senator." So Connolly got hit.
So when it comes to Johnson, after I guess Kennedy gets shot, what does Johnson do that also you raise suspicion to? I've showed the photo of Johnson on the plane where he got Jackie from the back to stand up beside her, beside him, and there's that famous wink. And I'm like, dude, she's covered in JFK's blood. Like, you're president as soon as the president dies. You don't need to be sworn in, but he refused to leave until he was sworn in.
Of course, that was his lifelong ambition. And that wink is a photograph, but that's outside. That's been taken out of the LBJ library. That wink picture where he's winking to the congressman. So LBJ gets sworn in, and he moves into the White House, and he has a general watching over the autopsy, and very, very, very suspicious autopsy. He's got a couple people who are going to make sure that we cover up the fact that Kennedy was hit from the front, and it looks like a headshot from behind by Oswald. He gets the guns all organized, and then he calls the sheriff of Dallas. It's only 2 days later, and he says, "Stop the investigation. We have our man. Oswald is our man. Stop." And he said, I think it was Sheriff Decker. He said, "What am I supposed to do?" The president of the United States says, "Stop the investigation." So they stopped the investigation. They let the 3 tramps go, right?
I've never see that's another area nobody's ever talked about was the 3 tramps.
Okay, the 3 tramps are in the railroad car, and they get arrested. And then what are these 3 white guys doing in the railroad car? And so there's been speculation that Howard Hunt was one of those guys. And other people say, no, there's a whole set of research on who those guys were, that they were arrested. So was the guy who was in the Daltex building, James Brading, convicted of like 13 felonies, caught trespassing in the Daltex building. He's arrested, and then they let him go. No questions asked. Gone. What the hell is a convict with 13 felonies doing in the building where Kennedy is shot and where he's not supposed to be? The whole story of James Brading, you've heard that? That's very interesting. You know that?
You can tell me it, because I'm honestly at this point, I'm just like, everything in Dallas, who's keeping tabs on who? Because there's a crap ton of people in Dallas and that on that day that shouldn't have been there.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And, you know, Jack Ruby, Bobby Kennedy said, they say that Jack Ruby was this mentally off guy who owned a nightclub, who was upset that Mrs. Kennedy would have to come to Dallas and testify, and he shot Oswald. That's the cover story. Okay. And that's why he impulsively shot Oswald.
Well, the defense he made was that he had an epileptic seizure or something like that and shot Oswald. That comes from Tom O'Neill's book, Chaos, when he was looking into MK Ultra and the Manson murders. He found Joyon West, who happened to be the psychiatrist for Jack Ruby before he went nuts. And he happened to be the only one that administered a flu shot to Jack Ruby.
Wow, interesting. So Jack Ruby, there's phone calls that he made in the 3 months before the assassination, and he made dozens and dozens of long distance telephone calls. And Bobby Kennedy said he called more mafiosi than I ever called in front of my committee on crime. Jack Ruby called all the mafiosi that Bobby Kennedy knew. Jack Ruby was up to his ears in mafia connections. Chicago Mafia, he had worked for Al Capone, and they hid, the Warren Commission hid all of that. The first visitor that Jack Ruby had in jail was a mafia guy named Joseph Campisi. And he probably said, "Don't worry, Jack, we'll take care of you." They had to silence Oswald. They needed somebody. Ruby had a pistol. He had a chance to shoot Oswald during Oswald's press conference the day before. He chickened out, or he didn't do it. And then this was his last opportunity, and he did it. And he shot Oswald And he had to silence Oswald. We couldn't let people know that Oswald actually liked Kennedy.
When it comes to Oswald, he seemed like he had a couple of moments where he could have easily said, "I'm being set up" or something. He said, "I'm a patsy," but he seemed also like he was keeping quiet a little bit, just because it felt like, I mean, if he is intelligence officer, if he's an intelligence agent, he seemed like someone was going to get him out of this situation, and that's what I pick up when I see his interviews.
Well, I think that I don't buy the idea that Oswald was an intelligence agent. I think because he was arrested in New Orleans passing out leaflets. Why would you get a person who's a admitted Marxist, who's been on television talking about Marxism, as the person to shoot the president of the United States with a old-fashioned World War II gun, and he had dyslexia, and he wasn't that good of a shot. I mean, I don't buy the fact that he was an intelligence agent. I believe that he was set up in New Orleans by a guy named Guy Bannister, who said, "Hey, we want to get you on television. We want to have you pass out leaflets and show that you're a Marxist, and because we want to have you infiltrate these left-wing organizations. How would you like a job?" And he said, "Oh, it's much better than working in a coffee company." And so he thought he said, I, um, I found my dream at the end of the rainbow in New Orleans to his friend. And he was working with Guy Bannister in New Orleans. And that's where they were sort of setting Oswald up. But they didn't know what they were setting him up for. They were just getting ready. And then he moves to Dallas.
He gets a job at the book depository building.
Yeah. And I think Oswald is standing on the first floor, and he's talking to a black janitor or a friend of his he said, "What's going on outside?" He said, "Oh, Kennedy's coming. Don't you know that?" That was at 9 a.m.
So, do you fall more in line with Prayer Man, that he was on the steps of the TSBD when the shots were fired, or do you
I
fall?
think there's good evidence for that, except Ralph Sink, who does this, I'm not convinced that he's that legitimate, but I've seen the photo. It looks like Oswald's shirt. Looks like he's standing there on the doorstep of the depository watching the parade go by. Other people said he was sitting in the lunchroom.
Second floor with the Coke.
Yeah, and Anthony Summers says, well, they asked Oswald, if you're sitting in this lunchroom when Kennedy was shot, who else entered the lunchroom? And Oswald said those two people, and he was correct. So there are corroborating witnesses that say Oswald was sitting in the lunchroom. He wasn't up on the sixth floor.
Well, there was a number of witnesses that saw smoke from the grassy knoll, but nobody ever took the time to investigate that either.
Absolutely. There were 41 witnesses who said the shots came from the grassy knoll.
Do you trust Roger Craig?
I have to review my notes. Tell me what he said. I know his name. Refresh my memory.
Roger Craig was the deputy sheriff who talked about when they found the rifle. He said it was a 3.75 Mauser. He's talked about seeing a Rambler.
That's right. I heard that. Didn't he commit suicide after that?
That's what they said. Yeah.
Yeah. I think he was one of those victims of the cover up, but his story did not conform to what they wanted to say, so he got in trouble.
He also, one thing that's really important is that in that interrogation, Craig said he was there, and I don't know if it was Hosty or if it was, oh God, who was the main Dallas police officer guy there? I'm blanking on his name. But they talked about never seeing Craig there. And Craig was there, but the guy lied and said Craig wasn't in the room. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And Craig kept his story relatively straight. I think at one point in one interview, he might have slipped up on the color of the Rambler, but he maintained trying to find out who it was. And it collaborates with what all the other witnesses talked about seeing a Secret Service member on that knoll flash a badge.
That's right. So there are a lot of gray areas that I can't explain either, and certainly one that causes me to doubt my own theory is that there was a man who was a deaf mute standing on the bridge over what I forgot the name of the bridge, but overlooking the grassy knoll and the whole parade route, and he couldn't hear at all, completely deaf. And he watched the Kennedy's car, and he saw two men at the grassy knoll. And imagine now, no sound, and he sees blood, and he sees an explosion, and he sees these two men from the grassy knoll working together, and they pack up their stuff, and one goes one way and the other goes the other way. Well, I asked James Files about that. Were you with someone? And I don't get a clear answer from James Files. But this deaf man, whose name is in my book, and I don't have it in front of me, I think he's a very reliable witness. His father said, "Don't say anything. You're going to get in trouble." I think he's a computer engineer. And then there was a book written about this incident. Are you familiar with it?
Mm-mm.
Okay, look up the deaf. What is the name of the bridge that's overlooking the grassy knoll?
I just call it the underpass.
That's it. That's it. He's standing over the underpass. He's standing on that bridge, watching everything with no sound. And that's what he sees. He saw the car go underneath him, and all the bloody head and everything go right underneath him, and Jackie Kennedy covered with blood and brain matter and everything. He saw that driving right underneath him.
When he talked about, so James Files was one of these people on the knoll.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Mafia connection, like I said, the Lyndon Johnson angle is one thing I really haven't heard a whole lot about. I mean, I talked to Dave Talbot and plenty of other people that just focus more on, the cover-up aspect, the CIA's involvement and all that. But I mean, the CIA was working, it was organized crime. They were working with Mafia agents. So to think, is it like a scenario where they train these people to do regime change on Castro, and then these rogue elements, I would say, just switched it over and decided to take out Kennedy with the same exact actions. And that's why they covered it up, because they realized the CIA would be implicated on this.
Well, the mafia keeps its secrets, remember? So it's a nice organization to work with because, not too many people are going to be blabbing. They take care of their own. You take an oath of silence when you're a made man and you're part of the mafiosi. So I'm trying to remember the guy's name who was the link between the CIA Johnson and Rosselli. And I'm sure you know it, and I know it too, but it's not coming to me.
Do you have the picture of the guy in your head?
Yes, he was a gun-toting CIA operative. Jack Kennedy met him and said
Harvey?
Yes, that's it. William Harvey was buddy with Johnny Rosselli. Johnny Rosselli's his children called Johnny Rosselli Uncle Johnny. So those two, I mean, he organizes assassinations, and then he's talking to Johnny Rosselli, who was like a Hollywood dandy. He was a very handsome guy, dressed well, lived in Hollywood, knew all the people. He knew Jimmy Hoffa, knew John, and he was the one who took the messages from the CIA to the Giancana group and said, "This we're gonna do this." And they were all overjoyed that they could pull this off. And he's the one who said, "Okay, he's coming to Dallas, get ready. Here's the parade route." James Files went a couple days early.
When it comes to Lyndon Johnson being part, or I guess ending the investigation, what exactly did he like maintain to do? Like I've heard the phone call where he picks it up and he asks J. Edgar Hoover if how many shots were fired. And he's like three. And he goes, "Were any of them fired at me?" And it seemed no. And that's why I said it seems like a little bit selfish. But then I started learning all about Johnson and how kind of corrupt he was. Not only the scandals going on with Life magazine, but I mean he was pissing on Secret Service members' shoes. He was doing a bunch of crazy stuff.
Yeah. Well, his mistress said that after a couple of years passed, it was on New Year's Eve, and she said, "Lyndon, did you have anything to do with the assassination?" And he said he was mad at her for asking that question, and he said it was big oil, wasn't me.
I've heard the big I've heard the big oil thing get mentioned a couple of times, but usually it's a specific name. But I think at the time he was hunting off somewhere with, I guess, one of his friends who was a Nazi or something.
Who, Clint Murchison?
I think so, yeah. He owned the book depository building.
Yeah, there are so many connections. It's hard to keep up with them all, and but getting the actual drama together. Like, for example, there are many theories that Kennedy was changing the currency and the greenback, or the Israelis did it, or, and there are a number of theories that have plausible motives. But when it comes down to who did the shooting, who were the shooters, what kind of weapons were they using, where were they standing, that's where most of these theories just completely fall apart. But the mafiosi, James Files, Nicoletti, Giancana part, that makes sense.
How did you choose that one to be the one that you followed down and wrote about?
Well, first, I was impressed by Giancana's book. I was impressed by Jim Mars's book. I knew that the mafia was connected, really wanted to get Kennedy out. And I couldn't understand how they had inside information about Kennedy's trip, about the plans. How did they get? And then that's where the CIA comes in and Johnson comes in.
And you mentioned Braden. I've never heard that name before. You said the Dow Tex building.
That's right. Eugene Hale Brading was caught trespassing in the Daltex building. Now, according to the conspiracy, his job was to get the shooters into the Daltex building. That was his function. That was his role. And he was at the Cabana Motel the night before. He had a long criminal record, and he was working in association with the mob, and that was his role, and he did a good job. He got Nicoletti and apparently Rosselli into the Daltex building, where they were. The first shot comes from the Daltex building and misses. The Warren Commission said the first shot was 19 feet over Kennedy's head, hit a branch, hit the pavement, and put cement up, a fragment of cement into a guy named James Take. I forgot his. Yeah, and he had blood on his cheek from a fragment of cement. Well, that's the Warren Commission fantasy that Oswald missed Kennedy by 19 feet. But if you draw a line from the second floor of the Daltex building to James Tate, and the curb, it's Mrs. Kennedy's head by 2 inches. Are you following me?
Yeah.
Here's Daltex building. Here's the curb, and here's Kennedy's motorcade. And if you draw a line from the second floor to Daltex building to the cement, it just misses the top of Kennedy's head.
People bring up the example when it comes to the book depository building that if he had a perfect line before to shoot him right as he's coming at him, but instead waits till he goes down there. But if you're at the Daltex building and you're shooting, you'd have to be pointing down and try and shoot him that way. So you'd wait till he goes out.
That's right. A frontal shot coming towards the Daltex building would have been ideal because they're almost slowing to a stop and you have a perfect view. But instead, they make the turn and then the shots are fired.
So, did you ever look into the damage that was done to the motorcade vehicle when you when you looked at how the Daltex building was where the shots were fired? Like, because there's a bullet hole from the windshield as well too. or
Yes, the
fragment at
bullet hole.
least.
Now, I can't explain that bullet hole, by the way. That I know that the limousine was taken to Dearborn, Michigan. They removed everything and immediately
Scrub the evidence.
scrubbed the evidence, but it looked like a frontal shot from in the windshield, and then I mean, James Files hit Kennedy with one shot. Where's the other shot that causes that bullet hole in the front of the windshield? I can't explain that.
I've seen the windshield. It looks like something hit it, but I know that's like safety glass that they had right there. I just don't. It doesn't look like a bullet hole went through it. I've seen people say that, argue that it looked like a bullet hole went through it. It just looks like a fragment or something hit it, and then it. I don't know if it's a bullet fragments later. I mean, you
But
have the
it but it hit from the outside to the inside, not the inside to the outside.
so a shot from the
Right.
front that hit and might have broke and bounced.
That's what I can't explain it. That would be I have to put that down on my list of things that your theory, Jerry, is really good, except for these four things, and that would be one of the four things.
I haven't heard this theory before, but honestly, I mean, it has some weight to it. I mean, I think all the things you can raise flags at, they have a lot of weight to them. The Mafia angle, the Lyndon Johnson angle, the CIA angle. I mean, you could say the oil angle. I've never talked about that before, but anything that is better than the official story, because the official story doesn't make sense. And
Doesn't make
yeah, Lyndon Johnson, I mean, like I said, there's so much about his character you start realizing, well, why would he do that? Why would he do this? And it's just some like there's no empathy for killing somebody, or not really killing somebody, or known killing somebody, but just no empathy for a person that you were in office with dying. So obviously it has to mean that
oh
you had some part
oh
to play.
oh yeah. I mean, he called Mrs. Kennedy every month or so and said, "How are you doing?" But she actually felt that Lyndon Johnson played a role. I think she wrote some memoir about that. No empathy from Johnson. He was power hungry. Um, I have one more thought I'd like to give to you. This is my own little conspiracy theory. Are you ready?
Yeah.
No proof. No proof. Johnson kills Kennedy, cleans it up, eliminates the witnesses. Alan Dulles' part, and it's okay. But the Vietnam War is raging, and he's not popular. And he got to be president. Yes, he lifelong ambition, but it's really exhausting being the president during the Vietnam War. And he said, "I'm not going to run for president in 1968. And if you induct me, I will not run." Remember that?
That's when he was going against Nixon, right?
Yeah. So he says, "Hubert Humphrey is going to be the man. I endorse him to be the head of the Democratic Party." And he's ready to go and retire to Johnson City, Texas. And the cover up is intact. He's been the president, looking for a retirement, starts smoking cigarettes again. But no, he hasn't started smoking cigarettes again yet. But then he hears that Bobby Kennedy is going to run for president. And Bobby Kennedy enters the primary late. And everybody wants Bobby Kennedy to be the Democratic nominee, not Hubert Humphrey. And Bobby Kennedy is very careful. And he says, "No, I agree with the Warren Commission." And Johnson doesn't believe him for a second. And Johnson knows that if Bobby Kennedy becomes president, he's going to open up the investigation of his brother. That's the first thing he's going to do if he becomes president. So if he wins that California primary, we got to do something to stop him. He wins the California primary, and Sirhan puts a bullet in his head. Motive, opportunity, but I can't prove he did it.
Do you think Sirhan did it though?
I don't know. I think he was party to it, but there were too many bullets fired, and I didn't do enough research to know that speak with authority. But there is a lot of evidence that there's something wrong about how Bobby. There was no trial. Evidence was not presented. Same with Martin Luther King. plead guilty, go to prison, goodbye, keep your mouth shut. And so I think there's something there. And I do believe that if anyone wanted to see Bobby Kennedy die, it would have been Lyndon Johnson, who would have been afraid of what Bobby would do if he became president.
Can I toss one of my little conspiracies at you?
Yeah, please do.
I think Life magazine was like a shell company. Like they're obviously working with the government at some point. They had connections in there. I mean, star witnesses, the media fell along. We all know the 1035 960 document about the Warren Commission saying any new evidence that goes against the Warren Commission, you label it as a conspiracy theory. It's a damning document, but we have it. But Life magazine had a bunch of scandals going on Johnson. I know that gives Johnson motive to want to kill Kennedy because then all these scandals drop. Because they're not going to talk trash on the president. But it doesn't, any news corporation that is just a news corporation not working with the government would still be running the scandals, whether it was your president or not. And I start looking at Life magazine. Why did they buy the Zapruder film? Why did they choose to put certain frames up but then have to print a retraction? They made it look like the shot came from behind. You get all these instances where I start looking at like Life magazine, its involvement in all of this. I mean, the whole media manipulation we know government can do, but I look at Life magazine as like, it obviously was a shell company, which brings into the trial of Oswald. He was trialed already by the media. The media, whether he would have lived to see an actual trial, he wouldn't have gotten a fair course at all because everyone was already calling him the killer of the president.
Oh, absolutely. You're totally correct on that. Now, who was the Time Life? Did the lady? I know the people who in Time magazine were complicit, but I don't know who the people in Life magazine who owned it. Do you know?
It was Time Life. I just said Life. My bad.
Okay. Well, she was I forget her name, but she was definitely part of very close ties to the CIA and the military-industrial complex. And so you're right. Oswald was tried and guilty. But, one thought is if you realize that so much has happened in terms of killing witnesses and messing with evidence, the gun, the bullets, that you can't trust any evidence that is found on the Kennedy assassination. You don't know how much of it was tainted and tampered with.
I mean, even with witness statements as well, too. Like I had Bart Camp on the show and he was talking about the prayer man aspect of things, but he was talking about the interview. And now Bart has listened to the archives of Malcolm Blunt and also focused specifically on Oswald's last 48 hours. But there was a guy with a DUI charge from like 10 years ago, and he was black and he worked with Oswald and didn't give a testimony. As far as I know, didn't give a testimony. And I was like, what is this? And it had me looking more into Dallas police. And you realize that most of the members on the Dallas police force were openly KKK members. And you start diving into this aspect of like, hang on a second. Like, so what's going on in Dallas police? Why did they not care for Oswald better? Were they in on the plot? And it's like, you realize that most of that force was corrupt.
Well, don't forget that Johnson told the sheriff in Dallas to stand down for the parade route, that the Secret Service was going to take care of security. And they had 125 officers. And he said, stand down. And he ordered the Dallas police to stand down. So there was very little police involvement. And he also said, I want your motorcycle patrolman to drive behind the presidential limousine, not along the side. They usually would drive. The limousine is here, and they would have two motorcycle patrolmen alongside the doors. And Johnson said, no, move the motorcycle patrolman behind the limousine so that they could get a clearer shot. So the one motorcycle patrolman is covered with Kennedy's brain matter and blood. He's 10 feet to behind and to the left of Kennedy. That James Files hits him in the front, and his brain goes back to the left and covers this policeman with blood. The policeman thought he was shot. You know that story?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the evidence for the frontal shot. But Johnson played the role of having the motorcycle patrolman pull back and not be alongside the limousine.
Did Johnson ever make any statements or did make any like we have Nixon saying we don't want, the issue with the whole Bay of Pigs. Like we have that, which I mean, you can assume in speculation whatever you want, but that's a very weird thing to say. And Johnson did a lot of weird things. I'm just curious if he had any statements like that or anything where it seemed like he was slipping up, like maybe a glimmer of the truth.
No, very little. His biographer, who's written hundreds of books or pages about it, doesn't believe he had anything to do with it. He was very careful. He didn't leave any fingerprints. He did a good job in covering up this whole matter. I don't see any slips of the tongue. He did say, Nixon said, well, Johnson wanted to be president. I wanted to be president, but I wasn't willing to kill to get the job. As if I'm different than Johnson. You got to look up that quote somewhere.
That's pretty damning to me.
We have to. I don't have a footnote on that, but he said something like that. I didn't want to kill. I didn't want the job enough to kill to get it. Something like that.
I mean, I would have to ask. I'm just gonna be a dumb question, but I mean, do you ever get a little bit like controversial takes from people when they read like one of your books about this? Every researcher I've talked to has like someone that's like, oh, this isn't true or this isn't true, but it's like it's backed up by documentation, but it's just whether it's just an outside voice or not.
No, the one thing I get is that James Files is a liar. He said he was in Florida when he wasn't. He said he was in the special forces when he wasn't. He said he was doing this when he wasn't. And I said, well, I'm convinced that James Files has really bragged about things and made himself look more important than he is. I knew this guy and I knew that guy. And I said, you got to take this into account. This guy could just be lying out of from top to bottom. And people would say right to me and say, how can you stand behind this liar? So it's like I'm a psychologist. If you know a psychopath, a sociopaths lie a lot.
And they wear socks with sandals.
That's right. But that doesn't mean they didn't commit the crime. And why would James Files say he killed Kennedy? The warden of his prison said that he thought James Files was a bragger. And James Files said, no, the FBI guy came and talked to me. And the warden said, no FBI guy ever came and talked to him. And then he said, wait a minute, I went and checked. And I looked at it because we know everybody who comes into the prison. And lo and behold, an FBI guy did come and talk to James. James Files said, FBI said, keep your mouth shut. And the warden didn't believe him, but then he checked his story and said, yeah, he was visited by an FBI guy. There's a lot of stuff like that, but that's the weakest point of my theory. That a 21-year-old kid with a 22 brand new Remington Fireball with a scope shot Kennedy on the right temple.
There's so much about the JFK assassination. Every time I think, I'm like, I'm figuring it out. You don't figure it out. It just something else gets tossed up right on top of it. I'm curious. When it comes to things that you just don't believe, you don't go with, what are those?
Oh, lots.
Okay.
Well, what do you mean?
I mean, certain parts about the medical evidence, certain parts about the motorcade route, certain parts about were any shots fired from the book depository building at all?
I don't know. I know that the Dictabelt recording has at least 4 shots, maybe 5. There was the possibility of a mafiosi named Richard Kane or Morales from the CIA who could have fired shots from the depository. I can't prove they did. It seems that 4 shots were fired. Files fires 1. Nicoletti fires 2 from the Daltex building. I don't know who fired the 3rd and the 4th. It could have been because Connolly might have been hit by a bullet separate from the one that went through Kennedy's throat. That was an attempt by the Warren Commission to make a 3-bullet theory. So it had to pass through his throat into Guy's back, end up in Connolly's leg. That was pretty good manipulation of the data. But I think
it's called a magic
and
bullet.
that's right. And Connolly said, I don't care what anybody says. I was not hit by that bullet. I already heard the shot. I turned around and then I got hit by another shot. He didn't believe the Warren Commission at all. Connolly.
A lot of people didn't believe the Warren Commission. A lot of people still don't believe the Warren Commission. But I think JFK was hit in the throat with a fragment. There had to be a fragment. Nothing pierced all the way through. And if you're getting a direct shot at, his neck.
No. Files was using a frangible mercury round, which explodes on impact. So he hits Kennedy, the round explodes, it blows off the back of Kennedy's head. So if you had Kennedy's brain, you would find fragments of mercury in his brain. And that's why Files was hoping they would do an autopsy on Kennedy to prove that there were mercury fragments in Kennedy's skull, because he used a mercury round, which explodes on impact.
Yeah, but they did x-rays and they found fragments in there.
Yes, they did in the autopsy, but they don't know if they're mercury. They were fragments, though, very microscopic. But it wasn't just a regular bullet. It was a frangible bullet.
Where would someone get something like that?
Oh, and Files was an expert on, and you can get them. He was an expert on explosives. That's why they brought him to Chicago. He had been in the military.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Jack Ruby was in the military. Oswald was in the military.
Yeah.
It's just, it's a lot more research I'm going to have to end up doing.
Well, who do you think killed Kennedy?
I don't know. I wouldn't even answer the question. There's so much out there. I thought the military industrial complex for the longest time, but I've been starting to think about Nixon now.
Okay, but fine. Let's take your theory, military industrial. That there is a lot of motive for that. They were angry about Bay of Pigs. Allen Dulles was angry. A lot of people felt betrayed. But who killed him? Who were the shooters?
Well, don't you think it would be like the Bay of Pigs thing where Kennedy took the rap for the Bay of Pigs and he said, I am the charge of these institutions. I'm the person. It's the same thing. If you have members of the CIA, it doesn't matter which specific individuals, the CIA has to own up to that. The fact that the reason why the documents will be covered up, threat to national security, what? Because you had rogue elements that did something without your permission? I mean, that's just the whole organization. That person, whether it's Files or not, if there's other people involved that took shots, if they're dead, then the institution has to pay for that as well, too.
Yes, but you didn't answer my question. I'm interviewing you now. You've got military industrial complex. Who are your shooters?
I would just say rogue elements of the CIA. I wouldn't even pin it down to any shooters. You could say Roselli. I wouldn't even think it would be Mafia connections. I think
Roselli was he was a dandy. He was not a shooter.
Well,
but
like I said, I would just say rogue elements of the CIA.
That's too general, man. It's 50, 70, or 55 years.
You want specifics so you can pick it apart, yes. But I'm not giving you specifics. No. I'm keeping it vague.
Okay, but fingerprints, bullets. I mean, I'm not trying to criticize you. I'm just saying, if there's a good theory, we need to have the whole thing. And the closest I can get to putting it all together is the Mafia, James Files, Nicoletti, and those people in that vicinity. All the other theories I've heard, rogue elements, which one? Are you talking about David Morales? He said, we got Kennedy and we got that son of a bitch, Bobby. There are still 14,000 documents that are still being held secret by the government. I read the last 1,800, and it was in my video, and I went through them all. And only 3 of them contradict my theory. There are a lot of them are just junk, but I'll bet those 14,000 documents have the secret. But Biden is not going to let him out. Trump might have let him out, but he won't. But I don't know. I think the answer is in those last documents.
With all the things you can't explain in your theory, doesn't that give you hesitation of that maybe your theory might not be right if you can't explain so many or a couple aspects to it?
I'm sorry, but I might have 3 questions in my theory. but I got 20 questions about every other. I have not heard any theory about the Kennedy assassination that makes any sense at all. I mean, Gerald Posner is completely out in left field. And I don't have any other assassins. The thought that there was a guy shooting from the underpass. Okay, who was he? There is the one piece of evidence about the windshield, but who was that guy? Who was he connected to? What's his relationship to Jack Ruby? What's his relationship to JFK? And all those theories fall apart. So I might have 3 problems with my theory, but I got 25 things wrong with every other theory.
I question all the theories. I don't double down on. I would think that it would be more like I said, the military industrial complex, but I'm not confined to it 100%. I've heard swaying points from your side. I've heard swaying points from a bunch of people. It's just the idea that you can believe that it's case closed is the one I have a problem with. Like that there's just, oh, it's just one, because Oswald's description is so various, whether he's an intelligence operative, whether he's a lone nut, whether he's a person going for attention. There's everything starts to crumble apart at certain points, which makes me just realize that Dallas in 63 on this day happened to be a conglomeration of just crazy events and weird timings.
Well, Giancani's in the Giancana book, Double Cross, which I recommend you read. The guy says, Giancana says, nobody knew what happened. Just a couple people, only a couple people really know everything that happened, and they're basically dead. Everybody had a little role to play, but the CIA guy didn't know what this was doing. Oswald didn't know what that. Ruby didn't know how he fit. So even Lyndon Johnson didn't know all of the parts that went in to this process.
So good old plausible deniability.
I think so.
Well, Mr. Kroth, where can people find your books? Any other links that you'd like to promote?
Jerry Kroth, Amazon, JFK, check it out. YouTube, Jerry Kroth. That's it. My latest book is called The Kennedy Assassination, What Really Happened. All the best evidence is there.
I was trying to figure out what you're grabbing. Is it your book?
That's my book. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm going to link all your links in the description, Mr. Kroth. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.